Hello everyone and good day, and welcome to this session of Empowering Azure Synapse Analytics with Azure AD. And yes, as there was a comment that came into the chat, it might not be the sexiest and hottest out there topic, but it is really a topic that we need to consider from the very beginning. And especially if you start just trying things out, things are really easy in the beginning. But then once you have multiple people working in an Azure Synapse Analytics environment, well, things start to get a little bit complicated. So as you're going along in your implementation and you have started to use Azure Synapse Analytics, you put up your resources, you create maybe you need your Azure Data Lake storage first, of course, before you start creating anything else. You start with your serverless SQL pools, maybe. You need maybe some other pools as well, so dedicated SQL pools. You can kind of decide which of these portions you want to use, Spark pools, etc. And of course, then we have also the pipelines in the picture as well. And as you're going along and creating your resources in Azure, in the creation process, you might already see kind of a notion and nod to the concept of access control, and that it might be a little difficult because it says like, well, we will automatically grant the workspace identity data access to the data lake storage with this particular role. But if you want to make other users be able to access that data, you need to give them access separately. So you need the contributor role on the workspace, Synapse RBAC roles, and then the storage RBAC roles as well. So it's like, I need to manage this in multiple places. All right. So of course, the kind of downside with this is that maybe you end up in a situation that actually you have all your resources and you're trying to give access to somebody, but oh no, access denied. And that is, of course, what we don't want happening. So to make the process easier and to understand all the places you need to consider, what we're going to do is first take a very, very brief overview of Azure Synapse Analytics. I know there were some preliminary sessions before, but just in case, let's just remind ourselves of the different components that are available. Let's then take a look at Azure AD fundamentals. So just some basics so that we are on a firm ground before we start then looking how do these two fit together and what are the different aspects that we need to consider in terms of access control when we're talking about Synapse Analytics. So that is our goal today, and we'll kind of just chipping at it one piece at a time and then try to put the entire picture together of all the components. So I'm Heini Ilmarinen, and I work as an Azure lead at Polar Squad and also a DevOps consultant. I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP as well as an MCT, so I do some trainings as well. I am also a third of the Knee Deep in Tech podcast, which there will be, was it already? Sorry, I'm not sure, but there is a session that we did for this particular event as well. My favorite topic is around architecture, so anywhere where you need to figure out how pieces fit together, and this is definitely one of those aspects. I actually wish it wasn't quite as complicated, but currently it still is, so we need to figure out how to do it in the best way possible. And I actually have a mathematics background, so if anyone wants to talk to me about math, that's always an option, of course, after the session. And as you might have noticed, I'm a bit of a serial doodler as well. And today I have some slides, but we'll also look at these things hands-on because then you get a better sense of where do you actually configure these things and all the parts that you need to consider. So before we can talk about the access control side, we do need to remember kind of how is Azure Synapse Analytics built and remember the different components, because of course there is differences in how you manage access control in different areas of Azure Synapse Analytics. And of course, why we would be using Azure Synapse Analytics is probably that we want to work on our data in some way. We want some kind of data platform solution, we want some kind of analytics solution, whatever the main use case might be for our scenario. So in a kind of typical workflow, we're probably first going to take that data and ingest it in some way. We're going to store it somewhere. And then after we have it stored in some central place, then we can move on and do some preparation, for example, some cleaning of the data, just filtering something out, for example, but not really transforming fully yet at this point. Then we can get into transforming. So really think about making something new out of the data that you have available. And then after we get the data into the format that we want it to be in, then we want to, of course, get it someplace to serve it to the end users. And of course, one scenario that you would have available would be, for example, to visualize that data. And so where Azure Synapse Analytics comes in is to kind of overlap this entire scenario and this data workflow from ingestion all the way to serving, and with some integrations also to visualizations. And what Azure Synapse Analytics is supposed to bring us in terms of like connecting these different components and capabilities that we have for the different stages is that we have one single user interface that we can use. We have some other options as well, but we could use just the Synapse Studio. We get centralized monitoring. And with this, I would say somewhat centralized monitoring. You are able to find much more things in a centralized place in the Synapse Analytics Studio, for example, and in the Azure portal. But again, there are different components, so you need to know how to combine those together. And then lastly, we have unified management. And in certain areas, that works a little better than in others. For example, well, access control is one of those, and you will see how it kind of turns into a puzzle where you need to figure out these different levels of access to the different components that we have in Azure Synapse Analytics. And there is a very fitting question actually to this point in the chat about how was life before Azure Synapse Analytics? And of course, before we had Azure Synapse Analytics, we would just use separate pieces from Azure. So for example, an Azure Data Factory, a SQL database, maybe Databricks, and they would just be separate services in Azure that you would then have to figure out how do you tie the networking in together, how do you make sure the users have access to every place that they need. And specifically, the monitoring was then that you needed to go to each of those services to figure out what is happening. So really the premise here is to try to bring together all those capabilities and have these unified components available and unified capabilities that makes especially the management and tracking much, much easier. And if we look a little deeper at the different components that are within Azure Synapse Analytics, then we kind of find that there is quite different kind of tools available. So for the storage layer, kind of the centralized storage system that we use is Azure Data Lake Storage. And actually, before you create an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, you need to have a Data Lake Storage already created and a container in there as well. And this is essentially an Azure storage account with the hierarchical namespace enabled, nothing else. So just a regular storage account with that one tab on. Then we have orchestration capabilities in Azure Synapse Analytics. And this is something really you would use across those different phases to, for example, schedule the different processes that you create for the preparation and transformation and so on. And this is where we have the pipelines of Synapse Analytics that come in. And these are very much like Azure Data Factory. And the look and feel is actually very much the same. We have a lot of the same concepts. We need to know about integration runtimes, linked services, data sets, etc. And this is really much about moving data around from one place to another, or running, for example, one of the transformations we have created with an Apache Spark notebook, for example, and running that as part of a pipeline. Then we have the analytics engines as well that then are more capable of actually doing the transformations and preparations and serving and so forth. And here we have some options available. So we have the SQL flavor side of SQL pools, and here we have serverless SQL pools, and then we have dedicated SQL pools. And these are quite different, even though they are both SQL pools. Serverless is really, for example, on the payment side, serverless you pay by data that you process, whereas dedicated, you allocate some capacity that you want to use. You can then scale it, pause it, start it, etc. But it's a very different approach. And serverless is really kind of thought of for those, for example, ad hoc queries, but you could use it even as a data source for a Power BI report. Dedicated SQL pools, that is what is based on the old Azure Data Warehouse. So it is really based for those multi-parallel processing scenarios, where you would, for example, have a data warehouse with a star schema, and then you want to report on that, for example. So very different types of services. There is also like different things are supported in each, but in this particular session, we won't have time to go into those, but there are sessions on both of these later in the day, so make sure to check it out if you want to learn more about those. Then we also have the Apache Spark pool side, and this is for running really your Spark workloads within Synapse Analytics itself. And this is really like a very integrated part of Synapse, actually. This was not a service that existed somewhere before Synapse came along. So it is very like baked in and integrated more than, for example, the dedicated SQL pools, because even now you are able to also create a dedicated SQL pool as a separate resource, not part of Synapse Analytics workspace at all. And then we actually have a fourth pool that has come in quite recently, and that is the Data Explorer pools. These pretty much enable you to run KQL queries, so with a Custal language, and that you might be familiar with, for example, from log analytics in Azure. And again, brings just more capabilities and features that you're able to use within Synapse. And then for the visualized portion, you could, for example, integrate with Power BI from Synapse Analytics itself. So that kind of gives us a very good overview of the different components. And we really need to kind of know this to be able to even understand about access control, because again, there is different ways that we need to handle some of these different components. So before we head into that, let's take a little step and look at Azure AD fundamentals a little bit, because it is an essential part of this whole puzzle that we need to figure out to be able to leverage it to the fullest. So most organizations end up with Azure AD actually from using Office 365, or actually nowadays it's more called Microsoft 365. When you have those services, you also get an Azure AD. And this is where all your users and so forth are residing, and you can have their identities placed there. But just as well, you could start with Power BI or have all of these services together. And in the same way, also Azure gets linked to Azure AD. And what really Azure AD enables is that it is this centralized identity management that we have for the different Microsoft Cloud services, so that we are able to use the same identity across all of these capabilities that we might use. And very typically, we would, for example, have synchronization between an on-premise Active Directory and the Azure Active Directory that we have in place. And remember, even though both of them have the AD portion in them, they are quite different beasts. In on-premise Active Directory, we have, for example, forests and all kinds of structures that you can use to manage those users in a more efficient way. But Azure AD, on the other hand, is more a flat structure. Yes, you can have groups and have users in those, but there's not the same kind of hierarchical structure that we have in Active Directory. The other thing to note is that Active Directory was made in a time where everything was very much in an internal network. It is meant for those purposes. So it supports different kind of protocols as an Azure AD. So for example, Kerberos, NTML, and so forth. Whereas Azure AD is built for the web, and that means that it goes over the HTTP protocol, and that means that it supports, for example, OAuth and so forth. So those modern web authentication protocols that are available. And that is why it is so suitable for the different cloud services that we have available, for example, things that we might be running in Azure. Oftentimes also in our Azure AD, we have, of course, our organizational users, but it is possible that we also have some guest users from another Azure AD tenant, and those are just invited to our own Azure AD tenant, and then we are able to give them access to, for example, Azure resources. And of course, if we think about Azure, it is more like a collection of different kinds of services that we can have available, whether it is, Data Factory, Azure SQL, or in this case, where we're going to dig deeper is the Azure's Synapse Analytics, of course. But it doesn't really matter. On one hand, the Azure AD linkage is very much about those are the users that you will be able to grant access to your Azure resources. But what we do need to note, there is quite a security boundary between Azure AD and Azure. A lot of times people think that if they have global admin rights in Azure AD, then they can see all the resources in Azure. That is not true. There is a way to go around that and elevate yourself and gain access to all Azure resources, but by default, that is not there. And on the other hand, if you have, for example, owner rights on the Azure side, you won't be able to see and manage Azure AD resources. So it's kind of a good distinction to make and understand that even though they are connected, there is a security boundary there, more than between some of the other Microsoft Cloud services. But what we need to figure out today is how we really use Azure AD to the best benefit with Azure Synapse Analytics. And if we think about Azure AD, we of course have, as the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, we have users and groups. Those are something that we can define in our Azure AD. So if you have an existing Azure AD already, there will be your organizational users will be available there. But to, for example, manage access to Synapse, you might want to create some new groups that group your users together based on their needs. But on the other hand, we can also have some application identities in Azure AD as well. And that way we can also grant access to specific applications. And the third area that we're not going to cover today, just for your knowledge, is that in Azure AD, we can also have device identities as well. But we won't get into that. It's a completely different topic and quite extensive. And actually, just recently, Microsoft announced Entra. So Entra is kind of something that wraps together a few of the identity services at Microsoft. So you might come across that word when reading about Azure AD. You might come across this Entra term as well, and it's more like an umbrella for a few different services that concern identity within Azure. But when we kind of start to try to understand this gap between Azure AD and how we use it for our services, let's look at like one scenario, like one workflow that might be relevant. So for example, we might have a user that needs to create and configure, for example, our Azure Synapse Analytics service. That is something that would be the very first step when we're getting started. And so to be able to do that and have the ability to do this creation and configuration, we have to have that user in our Azure AD. And then we would be able to give them some Azure RBAC rights, whatever they need, whether it's just to create this specific resource or to create multiple resources. That, of course, then depends on the situation and the user. But I want to point out like a separation here a little bit about there is two phases to when we talk about access control. And the first one of these is authentication. And what really happens in the authentication is that the user gives its credentials, and then we check that is this person actually who they claim to be. So they, for example, need to give their password, maybe reply to an MFA prompt, etc. That is the authentication part, to ensure that this user is who they claim to be. And that is what Azure AD does, because that's where we have the user identities. So we log in using Azure AD, but after that, we are actually determining what can this user do. And that is what is handled by Azure RBAC. And this is also what is called authorization. So there is actually two phases to whenever we log into Azure. We do authentication and then authorization, but it comes kind of seamlessly that we only notice that the authorization doesn't work if we don't actually have access to what we need. And of course, we might notice that authentication doesn't work if we've forgotten our password, for example. So this is kind of how the pattern goes, whatever is the need for our user. So if our user needs to create and configure Azure Synapse Analytics workspaces, we would give them the appropriate Azure RBAC role. And then the authentication happens against Azure AD, and then the authorization is checked against Azure RBAC. The pattern remains same, but of course we might have different needs for what they need to do. So for example, someone might need to create a pipeline within Azure Synapse Analytics. Again, we need to ensure that that user is in our Azure AD, and that is what the authentication is done against. And then we need to figure out what handles the authorization in that case. What kind of rights do we need to give them? So that is kind of where we will be going next. But also note in this case that, for example, if you're creating or configuring your Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, we could have a user, but on the other hand, we could, for example, have some kind of service that runs infrastructure as code scripts. And there we would then have actually a service principal. So remember, we can also have application identities in Azure AD as well. So those are kind of the two types of identities that we can handle. I'm just going to take a sip. I feel like I've been blasting full speed, so forth. For the fundamentals parts, because I really want to make sure that we have enough time to really look at how this all comes together. I think this is probably a topic that I could talk about for a half a day at least, so 45 minutes is a little tight, but we'll definitely get to it. So maybe the very first question before we look at how this works with Azure Synapse Analytics Workspace is to just answer the question that we might be asking. Why would we use Azure AD, I mean? Well, of course, in some cases, it might be actually the only option to authenticate to something, especially when we're talking to cloud services. But for example, in Azure Synapse Analytics, one of the first things when you're creating it, it asks, do you want to enable Azure AD authentication or have both local and Azure AD authentication? So sometimes you also might have options of which method to use. So that's why we need to think like, why would we want to aim for a situation that we just use Azure AD identities? And that's actually my opinion. You should always, if you can, just use Azure AD identities. And this is because, well, when you use Azure AD, each user and application has their own identities. And it means that they have just one identity, unless you specifically want them to have two accounts. But you will be able to identify very easily who did what. They don't have to remember multiple sets of credentials or anything like that. They just have their own identity that they can use. But on the other hand, we also can use the capabilities that are within Azure AD because it is a full identity system. And that means that we're able to create the groups, for example, to ease the management overhead of the access control. But on the other hand, we are able to leverage things like multi-factor authentication to have that second set of checking, like, are you really who you claim you are? And we have things like risky sign-in reports that are available in Azure AD. And we might be able to find if our users are performing something that they shouldn't be doing. So it really gives us a lot of capabilities that are available in Azure AD that enables us, for example, to really strengthen our security posture in terms of our identities a lot. There is a question in the chat. I think I'll answer it a bit later, so I'll keep that in mind as we go along. So we definitely want to use Azure AD because there is many capabilities available there, and we really ensure that we have just one identity per user or per application, for example. And that makes especially the tracking and logging and things like that very much easier in that case. So let's start looking at what then happens after that with Synapse Analytics when we combine it with Azure AD. And the thing is, there is quite many things involved. So we have our Azure Synapse Analytics workspace where we have our serverless SQL pools, our dedicated SQL pools, Spark pools, pipelines, Azure Data Lake, and so forth. And of course, it depends in your scenario if you have all these components or just some of them. But I want to kind of cover all of them so you get the full picture of what are all the things that you are entailed in this case. So the one portion we talked about already is Azure RBAC. So this is what you would use to grant access to users who need management access so that they can create, for example, workspaces. They could create serverless SQL pools and the other pools as well. They can create integration runtimes and so forth. For that portion, we actually need these Azure RBAC roles to be able to manage those different pools that are available, because those are Azure resources. And Azure RBAC is what defines the roles and abilities that we have for those specific resources. What are we able to do? What are we not? And we have three main roles that we are at our service, one could say. So, for example, we have the owner role, and the owner role enables you to do anything with the resources. So you are able to, for example, create, delete, start, stop, but in addition, you are also able to grant access to other users as well. There is also a contributor role, and that is the same as the owner, except for the fact that the contributor cannot grant access to other users. So it is more limited because then it can't start to our owner roles cannot start to accidentally accumulate because other owners grant other owners and so forth. So it's kind of a best practice to have as little owners as possible. You should have a few, not just one, because you of course want to be able to give access to other users in all scenarios, even when people are on vacation, but you want to minimize that impact a little bit. And then lastly, we have the reader RBAC role, and that, as the name says, just gives you access to see the resources that are in Azure Synapse Analytics. So that is kind of the first layer that we have to handle. But the fact is that within an Azure Synapse Analytics workspace, we also have artifacts. We might create pipelines, we might create data sets, and of course, we're going to need some kind of access to those resources as well. And to handle that part, we are going to need Synapse Roles. And there is quite a list of these Synapse Roles now. When we were in the preview phase of Synapse Analytics, there were much less. There were 3 main roles. Now it's more like 10, 15, something like that. And there is one main role, which is the Synapse Admin, and that is pretty much the one role that gives you access to everything within the Synapse Analytics workspace. So you can really think of the distinction that the Azure RBAC is for the management of the services, whereas the Synapse roles give you access within the workspace itself. So you gain access to running notebooks, SQL scripts, creating pipelines, and so forth with these Synapse roles. But there is many different roles that you are able to use. We'll take a look at that a little bit later of how you can then assign these. But those are what you're going to need if you need to work within the workspace, which most of our data professionals are going to need. They don't just want to start and stop pools. They will actually want to make something that is of value with the data. So for them, the Synapse roles is probably where you need to start. Then for the SQL side, the Synapse roles aren't quite sufficient unless we use the admin role for everyone. Then you get granted automatic DB owner rights to the SQL pools, but we probably don't want everyone having DB owner roles everywhere. So we do have the possibility of granting more granular SQL roles, and that would be the process would be the same as for creating users and giving them access for a regular Azure SQL, or if you worked with the old data warehouse, the process is the same. But there is another portion that we have to handle, and that is done with the SQL roles. And that is not all. There is one more portion. You notice that the Azure Data Lake storage is kind of outside of the Synapse Analytics workspace box. That is because it is essentially a separate Azure resource. So I like to describe it as being something external to Azure Synapse Analytics, but we do have a tight integration with it. and are able to use it as that central data place for all our queries and whatever we do. Also, the Synapse Analytics workspace handles a lot of the metadata and things for the serverless SQL pools and the Spark pools in the Azure Data Lake storage. So yes, we need some Azure roles. And actually, there is very particular roles that you're going to need for the storage. Because even if you have owner rights, that doesn't give you access to the data layer of any service. So just as with Synapse Analytics Workspace, if you just have the owner role, it's not going to give you access into the Synapse Analytics Workspace. If you have those Azure RBAC roles and you have owner, you won't be able to read the data in Azure Data Lake Storage, actually. You need a separate role. And for that, you need at least the storage blob data contributor role, or the storage blob data owner works as well. So like one good way to distinguish between those is that the main Azure RBAC roles, owner, contributor, reader, they only give you access to the management layer. Then there can be some resource-specific roles in the Azure RBAC system that have been built later, and those can then maybe grant you access to the data layer. But these aren't available to each service. So that's, for example, why we have then separately Synapse roles. Those are kind of the access to the data layer side. And that's why we have also the SQL roles. So for Synapse Analytics, we actually have to combine all of these. So it is quite a puzzle that we need to then figure out, like, how are we gonna give access to our users? So at this point, let's start looking at things a little more in practical sense. So I have a Synapse Analytics workspace that I have created previously, and you see my information here. And right away, you can actually see this Azure Active Directory here on the left. And so this allows you to manage the administrator to your Synapse Analytics workspace, except this is actually more a role that allows you to manage who has access to the SQL pools. I don't like the wording here because it's a bit vague and it gives maybe kind of like you're managing access to the entire workspace, but this is actually a setting that mostly affects the dedicated SQL pool, because that is the only one where there has been an option of having local authentication enabled. So if you want to only have Azure AD authentication for this workspace, meaning the dedicated SQL pools mainly, then you would click this and all would be good. By default, when you create a workspace, the person who creates the workspace gets given this Active Directory admin role, as you can see, and you can only set users and groups within your organization. That's important to add. And by default, it sets the managed service identity of this workspace to the admin group, admin object here. So you have kind of these two different admin things that you can set, and you can only have one admin in here at once. So for example, I think I have a group here. For some reason, it's not showing up. Well, whatever group I want to choose, I could choose that group, and then all the users that are within that group are able to get that DB owner in the dedicated SQL pool. So you always want to ensure that you have an Azure AD admin set, and probably you want to do it through a group, because then you can just put in users, remove them when the situation changes, because the fact is you can only have one. So it's not very efficient if you just have one user in there. With Synapse Analytics, actually also all the Synapse admins also get the same roles in the SQL databases as the Azure Active Directory admin. So it's not so much of an effect. They can still then add subsequent users in the future as well. So that is the one thing you are going to set. Then actually the one portion that we were talking about previously, the Azure RBAC, that is what you would control through the access control. So you would be able to add a new user, give it the sufficient privileges that you want. So for example, contributor, and then you just need to grab your members that you need here. And you would also be able to get managed identities too, if that is what you actually need. So you can find a few of these, and for example, that. But we're not going to assign that to our Synapse workspace because it's not needed. So this is at the workspace level. And this is, remember, the Azure RBAC roles, the ones kind of at the very edge. And then we talked about, well, there's some other aspects that we have to handle as well. Oh, that's super small. Sorry about that. So if we navigate to the Synapse Studio, we can find another Manage tab. And here we have Access Control. And this is where we manage the Synapse roles themselves. So I'm the one who created this particular Synapse workspace, so my account is there. But then also the managed identity of this Synapse Analytics workspace is here as well. So that is there too. And so here you can see the type is service principal, but it is a managed identity actually in this case. So if I needed to add anybody else, I can see that there is quite a list of users here. So I can then figure out like, well, what is the role that my users need? If they're working more on the SQL side, then, for example, the SQL admin might be appropriate. If more on the Spark side with notebooks, etc., then the Spark admin. The contributor is more like a general role that you get to many things, but you do not, for example, get to assign other users those roles. And then I can just search for my users that I want to add or my groups that I want to add and give to that role. So that way they would get access to this workspace as well. So that is the main access control side here in Synapse Analytics Workspace. As mentioned, then by default, your SQL admins, so that would mean currently, Synapse admins, these ones, they get the DB owner rights to the SQL pools. But if I wanted to add any other users, I would actually have to come to my SQL pools and then sorry, I'm in the wrong place. Create, for example, a SQL script, connect to my database that I want to do this in, and run queries for adding users, just as you would in a regular SQL database. So it's like a different level of access control here. And it depends on what the user is doing, whether it requires access controls to their own user, because in some cases, you can use the managed service identity that is for the workspace itself, but in some cases, you won't be able to use that. I have no idea where the time is going today. Very, very fast. So there was a question about service accounts a little bit before, and I would say that if you need a service account, that might be totally possible that you do need it. Use a service principal. Do not use like a regular user account in Azure AD. That way you have better control over that identity. And of course, if it's an Azure resource that needs the service account, then preferably it would be better to have a managed service identity that Azure handles. Then you don't have the management overhead of service principals. But I think like service accounts is something that you need occasionally, but do have like a service account or service principal in Azure AD for that particular service, not so that multiple services are using the same one. That way you have that same effect of having one account per user or application. Then it stays clear. So we kind of saw that there's many parts to this access control in Synapse Analytics. So the one thing to make this somehow manageable is that we need to have groups that we handle this with. Otherwise, like if you have to add every single individual users to all those places, to the Azure RBAC, Synapse roles, and then to the storage account specific roles, and then to the SQL roles, it's going to be quite a lot of work, and you probably don't want to do that. So what we need to do is, of course, first we need to figure out what are our user profiles. What kind of different groups of users do we have? So after we do that, then of course we want to create a group per each of those user profiles. So for example, we might have an admins group. We might have a separate group for SQL admins, and we might have one group for developers, for example. You can find actually a sample from the Microsoft documentation of how to set this up. That particular one has 5 different groups, but it just goes step by step what you need to add where, so it might be difficult to get the big picture, but that is definitely a good exercise if you're trying to look into how to set this up. But create your groups and add the users that are in that specific kind of user pool, have that same profile of how they use Synapse Analytics, add them to those groups. So if we then think about this setup from the perspective of the admin, what we would need to do is we would add those admins to the, for example, let's say to the Azure RBAC role that enables them to manage Azure Synapse Analytics. We would add them to the contributor group. If we want them to be able to add other users as well, then we need to have them in the owner role. But in addition to that, we want to add that same group to the storage blob data contributor role as well, so that they have access to the Azure Data Lake storage. Then we need to, in the Synapse roles, we need to add them to the Synapse Admin role. And that actually then takes care of also the SQL side, and we don't have to manage that layer at all for these particular users. So all through these, setting up these roles, we just want to assign it to the group. So in the future, we just add or remove users from that particular group. If we had a different profile of what they need, then we might, for example, give a lesser Synapse role, lesser Azure RBAC role to manage the entire workspace, and then give other than DB owner roles in the SQL pools themselves. So I would have so much to tell you still, but I am running out of time. So that means that I will start wrapping up. So what we've gone through in this session is we took a brief overview of Synapse Analytics. Then we looked at the Azure AD fundamentals. And then lastly, we looked at how we combine those and what are the different components and places where you need to set up access control in Synapse Analytics. And I hope that this made it much more clear on what are all the different pieces that you need to consider. So make sure you start with figuring out who are your users, what kind of access they need, and then just going through those different places where you need to have access to and figure out which role they need in each of those parts. So thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. And if you have any questions later on, I know we weren't able to go so deep in some of the areas. So if you have any questions, you can connect to me on Twitter or on LinkedIn, and I'm definitely happy to talk about it more. Thank you so much, everyone.